Welcome. I'm Ulrike Frankel, CEO of the American Leadership Initiative, and I'm delighted to welcome everyone to this morning's webinar. As many of you know, ALI has been a voice for fighting against protectionist and isolationist policies since its inception during the first Trump administration, and we have really advocated working closely with our allies and promoting policies that support inclusive and sustainable growth. As we talk about working with our allies, I think all of you know the importance of our economic and political relationship with our close neighbors of Mexico and Canada, our first and third largest trading partners. The president, as we know, has consistently threatened tariffs against both countries and implemented just last night an announcement on auto tariffs of 25% to autos and parts to take effect next week. So we're honored to have a great group of speakers today to really discuss these critical relationships. We're really very honored to have Congressman Greg Stanton from Arizona with us to share his perspective. He's representing the great border state of Arizona, and he put forth a joint resolution to terminate the application of IEEPA tariffs to Canada and Mexico, which we appreciate. He is fourth term representing Arizona and sits on the Western Hemisphere Committee of House Foreign Affairs Committee. He will kick us off. We'll hear Mexican perspective from Vanessa Rubio. She's a three-time deputy minister in different ministries, and she's currently the associate dean and professor of public policy at the London School of Economics. And we will get our Canadian perspective from Christopher Sands, who is the head of the Canadian Studies Center at the Wilson Center. And lastly, but not least, our program will be moderated by Kellie Meiman, who is senior counselor at McLarty, but started her career as a foreign service officer throughout Latin America, and spent time at USTR negotiating on Latin America. So before we start, there are a couple of housekeeping announcements. Number one, we are recording this session and it will be available on our website. Number two, there are a couple press people in our audience, so this program will be on the record. Finally, if you want to ask a question, please post it in the chat, and we will get to it after each participant speaks. We hope to have a question answer session. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Congressman Stanton.
All right, thanks, Ori. Thanks for hosting this and the important work of American Leadership Initiative. We appreciate what you do, and your work is more important now than ever. I'm excited to be on with these other outstanding panelists who I've known and respected and followed their work. And I just want to say something before we start, because Chris Sands is on the call. The Wilson Center, which was unfortunately the subject of one of President Trump's executive orders to try to reduce and even eliminate the important work of the Wilson Center, as a fourth-term member of Congress who works on foreign affairs, works on trade issues, the work of the Wilson Center, for me, has been invaluable. Your research, your thought-provoking articles, for me, are must-reads, and they impact me as a policymaker and the approach I take to these important issues. I am an old-fashioned member of Congress. I actually like checks and balances. I like the independence of the branches of government. I think checks and balances work. We are heading in the wrong direction. I know we don't want to go too far afield on these things, but they directly affect the conversation that we are having. I believe in the rules-based order, especially post-World War II, that has been so successful for the United States, both from a military perspective and from an economic perspective, and increasingly over in a trade perspective. I was elected to Congress during the first Trump administration. Trump, I guess when he was the 45th president of the United States, we negotiated USMCA. We renegotiated NAFTA. That is one of the shining moments of bipartisanship from the first Trump administration. It was a big victory, not a perfect document, but a really good document, a document that included provisions as it relates to improved labor standards and environmental standards. And since then, I thought that was the blueprint for how we're going to work together in the North American region. I'd love to see a debate between Trump 47 and Trump 45 on trade policy, because it appears we're heading in a very different direction, a direct attack on the work that was done in 2019-20 to get to where we are with USMCA. This should be a golden moment for partnership between United States, Canada, and Mexico. I thought the greatest economic competition we had was between the United States and China for world leadership as it relates to the economy and trade. And probably the number one thing we can do to win that competition is have the strongest North American economic partnership that we possibly can. Apparently, we're going in a very different direction. Every country for itself, or I guess it's somewhat the law of the jungle in that regard. We're going to tell our longtime partners that have relied on the consistency of the United States, the consistent leadership of the United States, that they can no longer rely on that leadership. The policies presented by this president, tariffs one day, maybe not tariffs the next day, whether you say nice things to him the next day and they go away. That is not strong, consistent leadership. It takes us in the wrong direction. So I just wanted to kind of get that off my chest, because this is, what are we doing as the world leader that the rest of the world has relied upon? Just by way of example, we passed the Chips and Science Act. No state in the country has better benefited from that than Arizona. TSMC, the Taiwanese semiconductor company, in large part because of those world tensions between the United States and Beijing, already has invested $60 billion. The largest foreign direct investment anywhere in the United States of America is happening in the city that I used to lead as mayor in Phoenix, Arizona, as a direct result of this decision to have a strong industrial policy, the Chips and Science Act. And the best way to take advantage of that is to have a secure supply chain, especially with our friends in Canada and Mexico, because so much of those semiconductors are going to be utilized for United States military purposes and our weapon systems. We need a secure supply chain. We need Canada and Mexico to have a secure supply chain. The president just announced 2 weeks ago an additional, and on top of that, $100 billion of additional investment by TSMC. Now, we've had a little fight about what was the real reason for it. Was it the decision of the United States through the Chips and Science Act to have an industrial policy that promoted this most important industry, or was it the threat of tariffs? I don't think a company is going to invest $100 billion because of the threat of short-term tariffs. Chris wrote a really good article making the case, and I read it, and it was an important article that said, our company's really going to invest billions of dollars in infrastructure for increased manufacturing when these tariffs may or may not go away tomorrow, but may go away certainly the next administration in just a few years. You got to have long-term consistent policy to bring that type of large investment. So I don't think it was tariff policy, but this should be a golden moment. And I'm so concerned that we are blowing it in terms of our world leadership and winning this competition with China right now. Again, this tariff policy, I think, generally sets us in the wrong direction across the board. 25% tariffs. The United States deciding we're going to go it alone. And obviously we know long term, if we continue in that direction, the the rest of the world will figure out a workaround around the United States. We are not the only country on this globe. We have to be smart and work with our partners. But, I also say, I've been a critic a little bit of our friends in Mexico. I've been a longtime friend in Mexico, so we have honest conversation among our friends. I do believe some of the reforms that have been put into place in the last administration in Mexico and the current one. I'm a great admirer of President Sheinbaum. I think she's a brilliant leader. I really respect her, but I think the judicial reforms were a step in the wrong direction because we want more American investment in Mexico to help secure those supply chains. And I think confidence in the Mexican judicial system is critical for that investment. I think that there was some backsliding, what we've seen in that regard. We need to see improvements in energy policy there as well. And then also to have a stronger security network. By the way, U.S., Mexico, and Canada needs to have a stronger security network in order for us to maximize the chances of success in what should be, as I described, this kind of wonderful moment bringing North America closer together. So I think the United States needs to look in the mirror and say what we can do better. Obviously, we're heading, I believe, the wrong direction with these across-the-board tariffs. Our next-door neighbors need to look in the mirror and say what they sincerely can do to improve, to create this stronger North American network to take on China. And that is kind of the theme that I have, is that what should be this golden moment, what can be this golden moment, we may lose. And I'm very concerned about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. Passing the word to you, Vanessa, to give us the Mexican perspective, please.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Thank you, Orit, and to the ALI for this invitation. And it is a pleasure to be sharing this panel with Congressman Stanton and with Chris Sands, and of course, being moderated by such a wonderful expert on trade, in particular, Kelly. So thank you so much. And greetings from London. I believe that, of course, each of the three partners of USMCA have their own challenges. I also understand that we are, the three of us, in three very different political moments, and that's also something that we should understand, no? So once we understand this, but once we also understand history, and I very much agree with what Congressman Stanton just mentioned, I truly believe that North America is called to be the most competitive region in the world if we do the right things together. And for that, each of us three have to look into our own mirrors and to see what we need to improve domestically speaking, take our own decisions to improve the ecosystems in terms of productivity, in terms of competitiveness, in terms of rule of law, certainty, creating employment, and becoming that force that needs the other two partners to become, what I was saying, the most competitive region in the world, which I am sure we could be, for the benefit of our three populations, not one or the other, no? So the benefit of the three. But being also very, very pragmatic, and also looking into the reality, because we are reacting to the reality today. What we're seeing today in relation to the policies being implemented by the current government in the United States, I think what I would like to convey to the audience is that in the case of Mexico in specific, we are not having a substantive structural discussion on trade. We're having a discussion on two other topics, one of them being security. That security is being discussed in two levels, one in very specific border crossings of fentanyl and fentanyl trafficking, and the other organized crime in Mexico. And the other discussion is migration. So there's two discussions that are not trade related. One is fentanyl and the other is organized crime in Mexico, and the other is migration, that I think we should have, and that any partner of the United States, in this case Mexico, should have with the current circumstance we have. And as the Mexican president also has pointed out, President Sheinbaum, we should also have a conversation on why 65% of the arms that arm organized crime cartels in Mexico flow from the United States to Mexico. And we should also have a discussion on a series of elements that pertain to the bilateral relationship that we have had over the centuries, and that is a very intricate one, and that is a very complex one. That is one thing, but the element here that puts a lot of noise and creates a lot of uncertainty and induces the lack of predictability to doing business in the region is that basically tariffs are being used as a weapon and are being used as an element to try to make changes in two policies in Mexico, one security and the other migration. But we are yet to have a deep structural dialogue on trade on a trilateral basis and also on a bilateral basis. So what we're seeing today is basically 4 buckets of tariffs that are being put forward. One, the first tariff that was set forth was 25% blanket tariffs. They lasted only for a few hours. We also saw the special tariffs on specific goods like steel, like aluminum, like the car sector in these very early hours. We also saw country-specific tariffs. That's the third bucket. And finally, there's a fourth bucket, which is the policy-related tariffs, who are very targeted, who can be and are being highly political, and they can open up a Pandora box. I have discussed that there's some on security, there's some on migration, but you can think about climate, you can think about fiscal policies related tariffs. So in this new context, I think what one can do, first of all, is what President Sheinbaum has been doing, which is putting some cold water on the dialogue. We don't want to escalate discussions. We don't want to get into irrational arguments that only hurt the bilateral relationships that we have had, the very productive and very friendly, of course complex and of course tense at some moments in time, but very close and friendly relationships that we have had with the United States. So after putting cold water, I think what one should discuss is that there is an issue on security, and Mexico is willing, as the president has been saying so, to sit on the table, to upgrade the actions that Mexico is doing to increase security for Mexicans, first of all, but also security for Americans and security in the world. And then also to reduce the migration flows and address migration in a more proactive and a positive way. So I think that is a dialogue that needs to happen. Mexico has been very clear that we're open to that dialogue, to having results in the short, medium, and long term. But one thing that is very important to learn here is that if you go too far with the strategy of tariffs, what you're going to do is exactly the opposite of what you're intending to do. You don't want to undermine the possibility of Mexico to having a strong government. You don't want to undermine the possibility of Mexico to having economic growth, to creating employment, to creating prosperity in the country. Because a country that does not grow, a country that goes to stagnation or has an economic crisis at some point in time, and if this goes to the worst case scenario, and if you have a country that lacks predictability, a country that does not receive investment, a country in which migration escalates out of all of this, you're going to be creating exactly the opposite of what you want to achieve on migration and the opposite of what you want to achieve on security. So what you want is a stable Mexico, a prosperous Mexico, a growing Mexico, and you want to have a mature discussion on migration, a mature and productive discussion on security. We need to do a lot more on security, and that I definitely agree, for Mexicans in the first stance, and for the bilateral relationship, of course, as well. And we need to have a productive and a mature and a structural dialogue on trade and how to upgrade the current USMCA that we negotiated with the Trump 1 administration, and that has been going on for these past years, giving a framework of certainty and a framework of predictability, which is essential for the 3 countries to attract investment, for the 3 countries to be prosperous, for the 3 countries to become the most competitive region in the world. And I truly believe that we can do that with a proposeful dialogue and a constructive dialogue. We don't want to engage in a tense series of discussions and irrational series of discussions with the partners that we are. No, Congressman Stanton was saying, yes, Mexico is the first trading partner of the United States and the first source of their imports. We're also the top five, between the top five trading partner for 35 of the states, top one for 9 of the states, including, of course, Arizona, top 2 for 17 states, and top 3 for 9 states. We're here to be partners. We're here to recognize that we're mutually intertwined and that we need to cooperate to improve security, to improve migration, and to improve prosperity through free trade in a region. And I'll stop my initial comments here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. So Chris, the Canadians have taken a bit of a different perspective. Would love to have you share your thoughts.
Sure. Thank you very much, Kellie. And I have to start by thanking Representative Stanton for his kind words. I take that, it's very nice to take that personally, but I really want to say thank you on behalf of the Wilson Center. We're all working really hard here and I think share diverse views, but this is a time when we appreciate your support more than ever. So thank you very much, sir. And I'm going to start, because I'm a kid from Detroit, I really want to start a little bit on auto tariffs and to say something that may be not obvious to a lot of people watching, which is growing up in Detroit, you see what happens when there's a crunch, whether it's inflation or maybe there's an external shock. Car companies don't turn on a dime. Their supply chains are quite specific and it's hard to adjust. It can be done, but it is hard to adjust. And in a price sensitive market where we're competing with products from around the world, what happens is that a company starts laying people off to lower costs. People go home, and this is an hourly business. We saw this on 9/11. You interrupt the border, people go home and they don't get paid. And that's what it feels like in a lot of the Midwest and a lot of our automotive states. When you talk about tariffs in this industry, it may be in the long run about shifting balances and creating jobs, but in the short run, it hurts people. It hurts people who really don't have a fallback necessarily. And so I think we should be careful to develop policies that give companies time to adjust if that's something that is going to be important over the long term. And as the congressman said, if the policy is unstable and uncertain, then you really aren't going to get the result you want because it won't be worth making those adjustments. And what you will get is layoffs, which is pretty bad. And I'm going to build on that a little bit, specifically to the Canadians. Some of the people watching will remember the 2008-2009 financial crisis, where General Motors and Chrysler were in real trouble. And the U.S. organized an expensive, I thought very judicious bailout to help those companies stay in business. Germany proposed to General Motors, they sell off Opel to the Russians. A lot of other countries looked for how they could advance their own industries. Canada was the only country that stepped forward with cash to help support the bailout. They didn't have to. They could have sat there and done nothing. But they put their tax dollars on the table to help those companies get back on their feet. And that's something we don't get from all of our partners. And so now when we talk about subsidizing Canadians and that the Canadians are just taking advantage of us, I remember those moments where they stepped up. And they didn't have to, and they helped keep our industry alive. That's, I think, the picture I have of the Canadians as partners that I would love more people to understand. They are a generous people, maybe a little slow sometimes on defense, but before we got to this moment, we had Canada broadly accepting that they need to spend 2% on defense. Before we got to this moment, when President Trump raised the importance of stopping fentanyl, Canadian step said, yes, we're going to spend more money on it. We are not pro-fentanyl. We are not, we may have been slow to realize how big the problem had become very quickly, but we are on your side. We're going to address that. Canada is a very willing ally until you start calling them the 51st state. You start riling up the public that feels sort of as a matter of nationalism, as a matter of national pride, that they're being treated unfairly. And that goes to, I think, the most fundamental thing that we have to realize about this very moment, which is that Canada is in the middle of an election. They have beautifully short elections. Their election will be in 36 days. That's a nice short election. I'm sure the congressman would appreciate something a little shorter here too. But right now, there are two parties vying, probably Liberals and Conservatives most likely to form the government, and they are vying in an atmosphere where they are trying to support good Canada-U.S. relations, but they also have to answer voters who are quite angry with how are you going to address U.S. relations when we're being attacked economically. And I think this is really hard, even for politicians who are fundamentally pro-U.S. that want to make this moment work. Even if we can resolve this quickly, we're doing some real damage in terms of what the Canadian public thinks of us. And that's going to make it harder for any politician, even a really good one, to figure out how to get us back on track. I think Canadians in this election, if I can sort of predict here for everyone, are going to vote for free and fair. They're going to vote for Canada to remain a free and independent country, not a 51st state, and they're going to vote for fair trade with the United States. And I don't mean fair trade in that sort of protectionist sense. I mean fair trade in rules that allow us to treat each other fairly. And there's an answer here, which I don't know if Vanessa and others would agree, but I think that the USMCA was a fundamentally good agreement. It had deeper support among Republicans and Democrats in the House and in the Senate than the WTO Uruguay Round Agreement, than NAFTA, and even than Canada-U.S. free trade. This was an agreement that really had support within Congress, and it has a built-in review in 2026. The president's talked about moving that review up. Let's get started on the review. There is nothing Canada would like more than to come to the table and to negotiate things. And if you're in the auto industry, sure, maybe make some changes, but make some changes that take effect in a year and then are likely to be stable because they're part of an agreement. That's, I think, a real opportunity for us. And I think that the president will achieve more of what he is trying to achieve if he's able to push this into the hands of a regular negotiation and his trade negotiator, Jameson Greer, who observed the whole USMCA negotiation. And I think those negotiations worked because of the care in which Robert Lighthizer, as U.S. Trade Representative, followed congressional guidance in the 2015 Bipartisan Congressional Trade Priorities and Accountability Act, which was passed during the Obama administration, but really set the rules out, and I think did an outstanding job. So I'm hopeful that we'll get back to that. There is a path back, but we really are doing a lot of damage to our Canadian friends and making their election harder right now.
Can I jump in on that real quick, Kellie?
Please.
All
I think I
right.
was on mute. Please.
So, a lot of people are questioning, including us here in Congress, what is really going on with this tariffs. As you know, this president has kind of waxed poetic about a certain time period in American history, the Gilded Age, in which the vast majority of revenue to the government came from tariffs, and we didn't have income tax at that time. And he sort of waxed poetic that that's a time he wants to get back to, in which we have the lowest taxes as an individual, and we're gaining the most revenue from tariffs. If that's what he wants to do, if that's what's really going on here with these, huge across the board tariffs are going to raise costs on the American people, he ought to put it before Congress. Orit mentioned the bill that I had to have a vote on the issuance of the national declaration of a national emergency upon which these unilateral tariffs were put on. Normally that should be voted on by Congress. We did myself and the ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Chairman Weeks, and a few others put a resolution together asking for a vote on that. And what did our Republican friends do? They put a rule together that basically said that the 15-day requirement, they'd have to have a vote within 15 days. Well, the rest of the legislative year counts as one day. It's a crazy legislative technique that they did, but basically passed up any congressional review of this. The real question is, does this policy of trying to have tariffs replace taxes as a way to provide revenue for the United States government, the services that are provided to the American people, is that really supported in a bipartisan way? Congress should reassert itself. But obviously, I mentioned earlier, I was kidding earlier about, being old fashioned and, liking checks and balances, et cetera. Obviously, for me as a Democrat, it's very frustrating to see that the Republicans aren't willing to even stand up for themselves, not as Republicans, but as members of Congress, and really assert those checks and balances and have a vote in Congress on some of these important policies. That's disappointing and long-term, I think, dangerous to the American economy.
Congressman, thank you so much for that. And I am going to pose one question to each of our panelists, and for all of our participants, please feel free to just drop your questions into the chat and we'll get to as many of them as we can. And Congressman, I thought I would follow up first with you. You obviously with your bill with respect to IEEPA tariffs attempted to put some guardrails on some of these policies. And I think as a lot of us policy practitioners look at the current situation, it doesn't feel like there are a lot of guardrails, right? So looking at the auto tariff announcement that was made yesterday, that was calling upon legal authority from a 232 investigation that was done in the first Trump term. What do you think it will take to put some guardrails and to put some of this Article 1 authority back in the hands of Congress? Will it take legislative efforts, as you've already done and perhaps are pondering doing with respect to this revival of 232 authority on autos, as has already been done on steel and aluminum? Will it take public opinion? Will it take some of the communities, especially border communities, being impacted? Will it take some American factories not having the parts that they need? I mean, I'm hearkening back to the USMCA negotiation last time around when Vanessa was a vice minister down in Mexico, when President Trump then threatened to withdraw from IEEPA. And in a weird way, it was one of the best presents he ever withdraw, from NAFTA using IEEPA. And it was one of the best presents he could have given NAFTA, because you had congressmen speaking up and saying, no, we need this agreement. Just would love your view on what it'll take.
Okay, Kellie, that's a fair question. Guardrails, what a quaint concept in the current situation in Congress. I mean, separate and apart from the discussion we're having on trade and tariffs, which should be a congressional decided entity with, in consultation with the president, but Congress needs to be involved in this. But you're talking about a presidency in which the very first thing he did was to issue an executive order stopping payment on anything associated with the bipartisan infrastructure law. All infrastructure investment that Congress had appropriated in a bipartisan way and signed by the previous president, which, it is our opinion that the president at that point only has one thing to do, and that is to spend the money for the congressionally appropriated purpose. Instead, he said no. And he believes under Article 2 that he is not obligated in any regard to follow the direction of Congress for appropriated monies, so-called this issue of impoundment. Same thing with grants to various nonprofits and communities, which, by the way, the public rose up on and they heard loud and clear, and the president walked that executive order back. But you're also talking about the destruction of agencies created by Congress, including the Department of Education, the most recent entity. I oversee the committee that has oversight over FEMA, the decision to destroy the Federal Emergency Management Organization that helps communities. The list goes on and on and on. And obviously, I'm a member of Congress and I happen to be a Democrat, so I guess take everything from that perspective. But our Republican friends, you're getting steamrolled here. We're moving away from our system of government that our founding fathers set up, and you're staying silent. That includes the issue of tariffs and the declaration of a national emergency for tariffs, which I believe that actually were put to a vote of Congress. They would have the courage to put it up for a vote, would not be successful, because at a time when the president ran for president on an issue of lowering costs, we know exactly what's going to happen when you have 25% across the board tariffs. Prices are going to rise, and my Republican colleagues don't want to have their fingerprints on it. So instead, they're going to try to do legislative tricks to avoid accountability on this very important issue of of a vote. So in light of that, the fact that Democrats are in the minority and our Republican friends won't stand up for the institution of Congress and the checks and balances and the independence of the branches of government. And by the way, there's a separate apart from that, an assault on the judiciary, which is it shocks the conscience what is going on in terms of openly threatening to impeach judges just because they've upheld the rule of law and tried to hold the executive in check. But I do think public pressure is where this is going to come. I think these decisions are going to inevitably raise prices on the American people. The American people are very smart. They get it. They're going to respond to that. These members of Congress finally are going to see that public opinion is moving away from them. And I think ultimately that is what is going to be the check under the current circumstances, the check on what President Trump is doing vis-a-vis these tariffs.
Thank you so much, Congressman. I guess I'm old-fashioned too. Appreciate your answer. Vanessa, I wanted to pivot to you next and harken back to something that you mentioned, that the administration in Mexico is very focused on security and migration and really creating solutions around that. And I think, President Sheinbaum has gotten quite a bit of compliment internationally with respect to her management of the current situation. But I wonder how she might respond or react to actions such as yesterday's, which is very clearly focused on industrial protection and trade, not on some of those security fentanyl issues that she's managed deftly in the past. How prepared is Mexico? They haven't issued, that I've seen at least, a retaliation list and haven't really showed their cards on what their plans are in that regard. Could you speak to that?
Yes, of course, Kelly. I think the Mexican strategy, as it has been historically, has been to negotiate. If there would be a country that would be, prized with having had the most complex negotiations around the most complex issues in history with the United States, maybe we would be perhaps one of the top two, no? So I mean, we're neighbors and we're going to stay there forever, mainly. So that factor needs to be recognized. We cannot divorce from your neighbors. So having said that, I think that if the tariffs, and I have been a negotiator in the past, as you were saying, I was part of the USMCA negotiations at the beginning of many other free trade agreements in the past when I was part of the government. If the United States government today is using tariffs with Mexico as a lever, as an incentive to sit Mexico on the table to discuss security and to discuss migration, mission accomplished, no? And that has worked well. And I think a lot of productive dialogue can happen in the future, and very concrete actions in these two areas can happen in the future to address these complex issues. But what I don't, and I could not understand that is a strategy, is to inflict damage on the Mexican economy. Because if you inflict damage on the Mexican economy, what you will produce is exactly the opposite, as I was saying. You're going to produce uncertainty, you're going to produce lack of predictability, you're going to produce volatility. Mexico could fall into a recession, no? And then the product will be exactly the opposite, because you don't want to destabilize Mexico. You don't want to have Mexico in a not growing track, which is already, by the way, very close to that. During Andrés Manuel López Obrador's government, Mexico grew only at an average of 1%. This year, the Ministry of Finance was expecting a growth rate of between 2 and 3%. Well, basically, the market is now pricing a growth rate around 0%. So what you want to do is basically to have, as Chris was saying, structural discussion on trade. What should we do better on USMCA? What are the new rules of origin that we should discuss? What are the new, perhaps joint dispatch of customs that we should do together. So that's the sort of USMCA 2.0 issues that we should be discussing. And I, do not believe that the current U.S. government would have as an objective to inflict damage on its two most important trading partners and its two neighbors, no? Because in the case of Mexico, the destabilization of the country would be very detrimental for the United States. And yes, Mexico depends 33% of its GDP on foreign trade, and 83% of our exports go to the United States. Is there a plan B really for that? Honestly, not, Kellie. I mean, there are plans, of course, in relation to negotiate and to put a series of strategies on the table, and there's tactics there. But we made a bet in the 1990s to focus our economic strategy on free trade. And we're focusing our free trade strategy on USMCA. So you cannot pivot away one day to the next in relation of such a structural policy. And if you want to go with a 25% flat tariff on Mexican imports, Mexico is going to suffer, the US is going to suffer, no, Canada is going to suffer, and that's not what you want out of a sane policy and a rational policy for the future. So I think, and I believe, I'm more on the positive side, and here I think that the President Claudia Sheinbaum has been doing a right job in terms of, putting all the cards into negotiating once again and sitting and negotiating once again. We need to use the diplomatic channels. We need to use history. We need to use a partnership. We need to use USMCA and all the frameworks and the levers we have and the experience we have in negotiating very complex issues. Migration, fine. Security, fine. And then let's sit the three of us to discuss USMCA and what else can we do to provide a more competitive context for the three countries to be more productive in relation to trade and to exports to the world, with jointly produced goods and services.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. Well, Chris, if Mexico made that bet in the 90s, Canada made that bet in the 60s. So we're having to think about questions we really never thought we'd have to think about, at least not in our modern trade relationship. And Canada's made it very clear that de-risking away from the United States is a huge priority. But like Mexico, incredibly difficult with the intertwined supply chains. I'm wondering if you could comment on what you think that path looks like, what sectors are probably most ripe for that, and then maybe just make a comment or two on the Canadian approach to retaliation, where obviously there's retaliatory efforts already underway, but there's also discussions, at least that I've seen in the Canadian media, about being a little bit creative, thinking about export taxes, thinking about intellectual property, services, tech. Perhaps you could comment just briefly on that, and then I'll open. I see there are questions in the chat. We'll go to those next. Thank you.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Kellie. So a couple of things. Canada, I want to divide sort of the Canadian economy into buckets. One of them is natural resources and primary products. So everything from agricultural goods to oil, energy, critical minerals, iron ore, steel, long list of things. You could even include softwood lumber in that bucket. These are things which are, to use the economic term, fungible. One unit looks like every other unit. And if the US isn't able to buy these products because they're 25% more expensive because of a tariff, the logical thing for Canada to do is to find another market that wants those raw materials. And it could be India, it could be Mexico, it could be Europe, and those products will sell. Their price globally is based on their availability. And, so if there's only so much around, you think about a Canadian raw material like potash. Canada is one of the largest potash producers in the world other than Russia. Very important for farmers, very important for fertilizer. Canada will find a market for potash. It may not be the US, but it will find a market. And so I think for those products, Canada has a lot of options. There's a second bucket of the Canadian economy, which is manufacturing, where Canada's really focused on intermediate goods. And intermediate goods require a supply chain. That's not the finished product that at the end of the day has a Canadian brand. It's the things that go in it. You think about auto parts, you think about aircraft parts. The congressman mentioned military equipment. Canada, since 1956, has had a defense production arrangement with the United States, which allows Canadian products to be considered domestic for military purchases. And as we ramp up in response to the fact that we've sent a lot of weapons to Ukraine and other parts of the world, we need to arm up everything from ammunition to more sophisticated systems. And many of those systems rely on inputs that come from Canada. Intermediate goods are where Canada is vulnerable because it needs to find something that plugs in its widget, if I can put it that basically. So there are some European supply chains that may be able to use those Canadian intermediate goods with some modifications. And I think one thing Canada will look to do is to try to be a gateway into the North American market. So let's say that you're a European producer. We have a rule of origin system in North America, which is different than the way that the Europeans manage trade. And there are percentages or amounts of content that are traditionally allowable from other countries. And USMCA says 50% North American, 75% for autos. Those rules can vary, and there's a complicated formula on what qualifies. But it is predictable. So European companies can sell things to Canada, not pay 25%. And if they meet the rule of origin, if we follow the USMCA, enter into the US market not having seen tariffs at all, even if there's a tariff on the European Union that the US has imposed. So it's kind of a way through. Now, if there is a tariff on Canada as well, you can see that a lot of companies in Europe and elsewhere will say, well, I'd rather only pay the 25% once. And so maybe they'll invest in Mexico or in Canada in order to bring those goods in. Maybe they'll invest in the US, but I think Canada with its intermediate goods vulnerability will be looking at that. Then there comes the third sector, a third bucket, which I think you rightly highlight, which is services, as well as digital services, high-tech software, et cetera. Canada's quite good at this kind of work. They've done a lot of compliance with rule of origin, environmental compliance. All of our famous consulting firms from Deloitte to Accenture, et cetera, are all operating in both Canada and the US and do a lot of work helping businesses to operate more effectively across the border, providing services to government and kind of consulting and advising. Part of Canada's strength is that many Canadians have either a US degree or a comparable degree from a great Canadian university, and they have the advantage of speaking English, which is quite easy for at least, I don't want to make fun of the Quebecers, they do speak French as well. So that's very important. But there are a lot of Canadians who are able to kind of come into work in the US and use that advising. Then you talk about AI, where Canada is one of the top 5 countries globally in terms of AI investment and expertise. In fact, just won a Nobel Prize, a Canadian in Toronto, for his work on the Vector Institute because of his outstanding work on AI. But there's software. Almost all of our major software platforms operate in Canada as well. And so there's a lot that goes on. And then you think about arts and culture and bands, not just Justin Bieber, but other acts that are operating. So Canada has all of those things. And typically, and then I should mention banking. Think how many Canadian banks we don't even think of as a Canadian, whether it's TD or BMO Harris in Chicago. There's a lot of banking and finance activity that happens in the US that has a Canadian origin. Now, those things don't typically get hit by a tariff. Those are because there's not a good that crosses the border, but there's a huge opportunity for Canada to grow. And I think you'll see a lot of that activity occur. That's because it's an area that's not restricted. And you'll see that without restrictions, it's able to grow. Last but not least, and I want to emphasize this because it's both good news, bad news. Because of 9/11 and then because of COVID, we've seen border disruptions, and the response from Canadian companies has been to build additional capacity on the US side. So when you think about the auto industry, my hometown industry, Magna International, Martin Ray, other companies that are really global leaders have opened in the US, employing Americans and helping our economy along just to handle the border risk, which was nobody's fault. Well, I guess 9/11 terrorists' fault, but in other cases, it was a disruption that they managed, not by saying, well, how can we build a wall or put a tariff or keep goods to ourselves, but how can we employ Americans and make this work for both of us on both sides of the border? The reality is the US market is always going to be bigger. 340 million people. That's going to be a magnet for Canadians. They're not going to burn that bridge, but they're going to have to weather the next 3 years. And I know they've talked about retaliation, some targeted retaliation. I feel that that's something that they are doing because the average Canadian wants to fight back. But the problem with their retaliation list and our tariff list is it's mutually assured destruction, as we used to say in the Cold War. It is a strategy that we should contemplate and never employ. And while I don't say Canada shouldn't fight back, I think that there's a powerful political desire to do that. God, I hope they don't have to do very much of it. And I hope we don't force them to do very much of it, because all of these tariffs in the short term are going to be so tremendously destructive, and they will fuel inflation, which we finally seem to be getting past from some of the inflationary spikes in the previous administration during the Biden years. But I worry it's going to come back. And I can say I remember inflation in the 70s. I know what that means to people's budgets, and it's going to be terrible if it comes back.
Well, and then we get into the public opinion aspect that the congressman was speaking to. We've got a number of questions in the chat with respect to the USMCA review. And
I just want to tell Chris, though, if you wanted to make the case,
if you could comment on both of those things, that'd be terrific.
I was just going to comment to Chris saying he made a very strong argument on all of it, but if you're going to make the case for arts and culture, you're going to have to come stronger than Bieber. You got to upgrade that.
Fair enough.
Let's go to the questions.
That's a fair point. That's a fair point. No, I was just going to pose the question to you, Congressman. We have a number of questions in the chat about the review, the USMCA review that's obviously upcoming and planned. I think most of us thought there'd be kind of the annual rollovers. There wouldn't be a full endorsement of the agreement. But in this environment, how do you see it proceeding? And what sectors do you think will be, most under study outside of the ones that we've already talked about here today?
Well, how do you have the 2026 agreement, which has to cover all of the things that both Vanessa and Chris have discussed, and the United States has some legit issues in terms of making sure China doesn't sneak in products through Canada and or Mexico into the United States. There are huge issues discussed, but how do we have that discussion in an environment with 25% across the board tariffs, which goes against the entire concept of a USMCA? So I think it's going to be very, very difficult to have good faith, sincere discussions about how to improve the USMCA in the current environment. What incentive do our neighbors have to improve USMCA if, as President Trump said, he wants these across the board tariffs to become, quote, permanent? I don't, that goes against the heart and soul of what the USMCA is. So I'm looking forward to a day when we can get past this time period of kind of all out across the board tariffs, which I think are self-defeating and will raise costs on the American people and be very unpopular. I want to get past that time period so that we can have the much needed improvements and upgrades to the USMCA, so we can become a stronger economic unit to win this economic battle with China, which is in so many ways that was the very point of the USMCA. But yeah, the bottom line is, under the current environment, a very challenging thing to ask our neighbors to participate in.
Thank you, Congressman. Vanessa, you wanted to add?
Thank you, Kellie. Yes, I just wanted to add on the fact that I think that once we begin on a conceptual discussion on USMCA, I think rules of origin are going to be essential. So rules of origin in terms of changing them, increasing the percentage in some sectors to be considered North American content. Of course, I very much think that other aspects, such as what I was mentioning, the joint dispatch of customs, would be at the core of this. Something like a trilateral CFIUS-like system for transparency of trade and investment from third countries. And I would very much see something like a sectoral customs union being discussed in this context, which is when you sit and discuss free trade agreements, you discuss tariffs between the members of that agreement, but you do not discuss tariffs towards third countries. What I see Canada, the US and Mexico negotiating in this new phase of USMCA is what kind of tariffs we're willing to put on third countries on specific goods and services. And this is what would be a sectoral customs union-like sort of conversation that I think would be very productive. And by the way, would address a series of concerns that the US has currently on trade. I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you, Vanessa. Chris, why don't you close us
Well-
out? Unfortunately, we're going to
Well,
run out of
I-
time, and then Orit, you can.
Well, yeah, I was going to say I wanted
finish us
to.
up.
Orit,
Ask
I'll defer to you. Go.
Thank you. I was going to ask the congressman one question, and then we're going to need to close things out. My question is, I'm wondering if you think the president is using these tariffs as a negotiating lever for USMCA. You know, he has had a history of doing that, you know, trying to get an upper hand and then, you know, trying to using it to extract concessions from countries. How do you see that potentially playing out?
Okay, I think the president's tariff policy is at war with itself. He gives a speech one day and suggests that tariff policy should be the new way to raise revenue for the United States. You hear that background noise because they've called votes a little early today. So as soon as I'm done with this answer, I've got to break off and go vote. But you know, one day he's describing tariff policies as permanent tariffs to replace taxation, maybe as a way to help pay for the tax cuts that he is planning on giving in the budget resolution that just came through the Congress. Other days, he describes it as a way for Mexico and Canada to better deal with fentanyl and fentanyl problem inside the United States of America. Other times, he talks about it in terms of the unfairness about how other countries are treating the United States. I think what the president owes the American people and the world is to explain exactly what his tariff policy is, come to Congress and get that approved so that it's not willy-nilly, it's locked into law, and then we can move forward. So I think the honest answer is, some days it is exactly what you described as a short-term negotiating ploy. Sometimes it may be because he wants world leaders to fly to Mar-a-Lago or the White House and say nice things and then say he won. Which sometimes you see world leaders do this, kind of stroke his ego as a way to get out from underneath this threat. We don't know what the real reason is. I am very concerned, though, that he is planning on implementing tariffs as a way to pay for the tax cuts, and therefore it becomes a permanent element of American policy. I think it's incredibly dangerous long-term for the U.S. economy and the people of the United States of America. And sorry, I have to end on that, but I got to do my day job, which is voting on the House floor. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Thank you
That's
so
great.
much,
I appreciate it.
and keep up the good fight. I just wanted to thank all the speakers for joining us. I thought it was a really great conversation. And I guess we will all wait and see what happens next week with the tariffs, if they go into effect or if he changes his mind. So if you're interested in learning more, or if you have questions that weren't answered, we can try to get the speakers to answer some of the questions via email. And if you're interested in learning more about the American Leadership Initiative, please email us at info@american-leadership.org. Thank you all. Thanks, Chris, Kelly, and Vanessa. Really appreciate it. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.